In this video, we'll sculpt this grotesque screaming man in ZBrush, working with this demo head as our base mesh. This tutorial is meant for complete beginners, and we'll keep the approach simple so that we can hopefully demystify the program some. We'll cover setting up visual references, masking, moving, scaling, polygroups and subtools, Dynamesh, my favorite sculpting brushes, and a basic way of exporting the model. When you first open ZBrush, you should see the Lightbox at the top here. If this doesn't open by default, just push the comma key to bring it open or click on the Lightbox button up here. And the Lightbox is a collection of assets that you can use to start your project. And so we'll go under the Project tab in the Lightbox and then select either the demo head or the demo head female. So double click on this. We don't need to save changes, and that will load the head. To move the camera in the viewport, we can right mouse drag to orbit. We can Alt and right mouse drag to pan. We can hold Control and right mouse drag to zoom, or we can push F to focus in on the project. And there is one other way of zooming that becomes important when you're using the tablet, which is if you hold Alt and then start to right mouse drag and let go of Alt, that also lets you zoom. So again, that's hold Alt, start to right mouse drag, let go of Alt, and then you can zoom. My intention is to make this man scream. So I want his mouth to be wide open and his head lean back and his hair kind of wild. And I would never try to make up this kind of transformation in my head. I find that it's much faster to work from visual references. At least we need a front view and a side view of what we want the sculpture to look like. I made this image in Midjourney with this prompt: front and side view of Renaissance sculpture of grotesque man, half animal with repulsive exaggerated features, an extreme facial expression, and wild messy hair in the style of realistic 8K. With that prompt, I made several images, and the reason I selected this one is I like the asymmetry of it, that he leans to the side, that his right eye is bigger than his left and it's higher up. I like the extreme openness of the mouth and the way that the lip curls here. I like the depth of the wrinkles, and the extreme facial expression I think is convincing of making the man look tormented. But I made a whole collection of these images, and they're in this folder, ZBrush Intro, Grotesque Visual References, that is on Google Drive. So if you follow the link in the description, you'll get access to these files, and you can pick a different one that you like better for your sculpt. I find that the easiest and best way of working with visual references in ZBrush is with the program PureRef, which at the moment is free, though I recommend giving a donation to them when you download it. And once it's on your machine, you can then open it up. It'll look like this. And we just need to drop an image in there. So the image that I've downloaded is this one. I'm going to move it over. And I'll double click on the image to make it fill the frame. And then I'm going to Control C, Control V to make a copy. And then we'll push Alt, Shift, H to flip that image horizontally. And the reason we want to do that is it makes it so that then we have an inverted version that we can use when we're looking at his right side. The next step you'll want to do with PureRef is to right click and go to Mode and select Always on Top so that it will float above your ZBrush window. And then you can drag the size of this window. Let me see, how do we move it? We right mouse button drag to move it around in space, and we can make this window a bit smaller, and then if we double click on the left image, it will maximize it. If we want to move our images in the window, we can hold the middle mouse button and drag. So let's hold the right mouse button and move it over here, and that should be a good placement for it. A lot of the work I do in ZBrush is with the mouse, but having the Wacom tablet available does help out in some areas. So when I sculpted the head, some of the wrinkles on the face and the hair were easier to do with the Wacom tablet. So this is how my computer is set up. I have an ergonomic keyboard and mouse as my primary devices, and then back behind above I have the Wacom tablet. And so I built a little stand in the wood shop out of plywood, and that way it's there when I need it, but if I'm using a different program I can just push it back. Now that we've covered some of that basic intro stuff, we can get to sculpting. When we look at the head in here, you can see that we have, on the right-hand side, we have these couple of rings that indicate where our sculpting brush is. On the left-hand side, we see a corresponding dot at the center. That tells us that symmetry is on. If we want to turn symmetry off, we can do that by pushing X on the keyboard. But we do want to keep it on for the initial steps because it will speed things up. By the way, something surprising that can happen when you're sculpting in ZBrush is your model can turn black like this. And if you look on the left-hand side, when I push the V key on the keyboard, you can see that it's switching the color, which has the effect of darkening the model. So don't panic if it goes black, just push V to bring it back. When we sculpt the hair, we'll do it as a separate mesh. So the first step we need to do is to make this man bald. And we can do that by holding Control on the keyboard to turn the mask tool on, and then drag to select the hair. Now, if we need to change the brush size at all, we can hold S on the keyboard to open up the draw size slider, and we can make it smaller or bigger. Actually, let's make it a bit smaller, and we'll erase out some of this mask on the front. And we can do that by holding Alt Control to remove part of the masking. And so let's go and we'll hold Control down to add to the selection. We have a pretty hard edge between the masks area and the not masks area. We can soften it up by holding Control and clicking where it's masked. And then now what we need to do is hold Control and click in this blank area, and that will invert the mask. And then what we want to do is hold S and drag the slider so that our brush is really large, and then hold Shift and drag across until it flattens this down to get rid of the volume of the hair. By holding Shift like this, what we're doing is switching from the standard brush to the smooth brush. So if you look in the top left corner, currently the standard brush is selected when I'm not holding Shift, and when we push Shift down, it turns it to the smooth brush. Notice also that we have some settings up here that change when we hold Shift down. So Z intensity defines how aggressive a brush is. And so right now it's set to, when smooth is turned on, for the Z intensity to be 100, to be the most aggressive. Notice also that the focal shift is different for smooth. So it has a softer fall off when we turn it on to smooth mode. Now we'll go ahead and clear the mask by holding Control and dragging a small box in the blank area. And now that we've made a change to the model, let's go ahead and save the file. What I don't recommend doing for saving the file is to use this Save As button here. This would just save the tool out with the 3D information about the file. But there's a lot more information we want, like the undo history and settings that we've applied. So the way of saving the project file is to do Control S. Just like in other programs, we can undo the last command with Control Z. And if we want to redo, we can do Control Shift Z. And notice also that we have this orange slider at the top. This is our undo history. So we can slide this to the left to step back through the previous changes that we've made to the model. As you work on a project for a while, you might see that your file size gets to be quite large because of storing not only the 3D geometry for the model, but all the previous states of the model in the undo history. So if you ever want to clear out this undo history to reduce the file size, you can go up top to Edit and Del UH, and that will get rid of all the undo history. Keep in mind, if you have a model with multiple subtools, and you're looking to reduce the file size as much as possible, you would need to delete undo history for each of the subtools. Our model is starting to lean to the side, and that's because right now we are set to rotate on all axes. If we want him to snap back to be more aligned with the grid, we can hold Shift and right mouse button drag. Or if we want him to look to the left-hand side, we can get him to be close to that angle, and again hold Shift and right mouse button drag. And we can get them to any other vantage point as well by just holding Shift and right mouse button dragging. I prefer to set it to just rotate on the Y-axis, and that way he'll stay more upright as we're working. We can also, by the way, as we're looking at this panel here, we can switch from dynamic perspective to an orthographic view of the model. so that can be important sometimes to switch. And we can turn the floor grid on or off, which can be useful for visualizing symmetry. On the right hand side, let's go to the subtool panel. And right now we have two different subtools. We have demo head and eyes. And demo head is the active subtool. We know that because it's a little bit darker here. If we click on eyes, that becomes the active subtool. And you can see how the color of the model changes when we switch it. So the active subtool will always be lighter. And another way of switching between the subtools is to use the arrow key on the keyboard. So if we go up or down, that will switch, or we can alt-click on the subtool to make it active. Now we're going to do some work on the eyes subtool, and there are two ways of isolating so that we only see this subtool. One would be to select this subtool and then to click on the eyeball for the other one so that this is the only one showing. An even easier way of showing just the eyes subtool is to come down to this dynamic solo button, and that makes it so that only the active subtool will show up. In just a minute, we'll work on moving the mouth over to a different subtool. But before we do, there are a couple of things I want to point out. The first is, if we look at the mouth from this vantage point, we can see a roof on the mouth. And if we come back this way, it disappears. That's because ZBrush is showing us just the outside of the mesh. We can set it to show both sides of the mesh by going down to Display Properties. And if we click on Double, that will show us both the inside and outside of the mesh. If we now push Shift F, that will show us a wireframe of the model. In other words, we have these black outlines that enable us to better see the faces of the mesh. And we see that different parts of the model are different colors. And what we're seeing here are polygroups. Polygroups just give us a way of organizing the model for quicker access later. And if we hold Shift and Control and click on a polygroup, it will isolate to show just that polygroup. If we then hold Shift and Control and click on the single showing polygroup, it will hide it and show all the others. Or now if we hold Shift and Control and click on the other eye, it will hide it as well. If we want to invert what's shown here, if we hold Shift and Control and then drag a box with the left mouse button, that will invert the visibility of the polygroups. Or if we want to bring back all of the polygroups and show them, we can hold Shift and Control and click. Now we'll go ahead and move the mouth to its own subtool. We can do that by holding Shift and Control and clicking on the mouth, and then click again so that it's hidden. And we want to go to Subtool and then go down to the Split section. And we want to click on this button right here, Split Hidden. And it's not possible right now because there's an issue with the subdivision history of these faces. Basically, subdividing is a method that we use in ZBrush with quad meshes. So it enables us to have a low poly base mesh that is divided up to have greater complexity so that we can do finer detail on it at the higher levels of subdivision. We're not going to work with this kind of mesh in our process. So what we want to do is just delete lower. So just push this button under the geometry panel, del lower, and that will get rid of the subdivision. And then what we can do is go back to under the subtool panel, go to the split section and click on split hidden. Now we'll click on the subtool with the mouth on it and click on rename and call it mouth. And what we want to do now is separate the upper teeth from the lower teeth so that we'll be able to open this up. Now we'll turn symmetry on with X. Make sure that you see the red dot indicating that it has been turned on. And let's zoom in on this little bit connecting the upper and lower teeth. If you need to change the size of the brush to be small like this, you can hold S and drag the slider. We'll hold Control to mask out this area that is connecting the two parts. And we'll be a little bit generous, selecting some extra just to make sure that we're fully able to break these apart. And now we'll push Control W. And it looks like nothing has happened, but if we push Shift F, we'll see the polygroup that we just created. Now, if we were to look at it and see that there were still a couple of mesh parts that were touching at a point, that would be a problem. But I think this is going to work. So let's hold Shift and Control and click on the polygroup that we just created, and then click again. And now what we want to do is go to, we could split hidden, but we actually want to delete that part. So let's go into the geometry panel, and we'll go down to modify topology and del hidden to delete that part. Now what we want to do is break the mouth into two different polygroups. The way to do that is to go down to the Polygroups panel and click on Auto Groups. And what that button does is it makes it so that any mesh that is fully disconnected from the other meshes will be its own polygroup. So now what we can do is hold Shift and Control and click on the bottom one, and then go back to the Subtool panel and go to Split Hidden. So now we have the upper mouth, which we can rename to upper mouth, and the lower mouth. We'll make one final change before we start sculpting. Let's push the up arrow on the keyboard to go to the body. And in the geometry panel, it says SDiv3. That means that we have multiple subdivision levels. So let's click on Del Lower to delete the lower subdivision levels. And this gives us a high resolution mesh for sculpting. To sculpt efficiently, it's always helpful to work general to specific. And what that means for the project is we try to make the large adjustments first and then get progressively finer in our detail as we go. The biggest thing that stands out to me looking between the reference image and the body is that we have an extra part on the shoulder that we don't need. We can select the outer part of the shoulder by holding Shift and Control and dragging with our selection tool, and that will isolate to the outer part of the shoulder. But there's actually an angled cut on the reference that I think works well, so we want to keep that. So I'll hold Shift and Control and click in a blank space to bring everything back. Now if we hold Shift and Control and look up in the left corner, click on the brush button, and then we can go to Select Lasso. That gives us a different selection tool when we hold Shift and Control. So now when we drag, we can create a selection of any shape. Hold Shift and Control and drag down like that, and then invert the selection by Shift Control, drag a little circle. That gives us a cutaway of the shoulders like this. And now we can go to Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. By the way, while we're on selection tools, if we hold Shift Control, drag a circle, that gives us a green selection. It will isolate to whatever's selected. If we want to instead hide whatever's selected, we can Shift Control Alt. Okay, so if we want to trim up this little bit on the shoulder that we don't like, we can just do that. And now that part is hidden. So if we click on Delete Hidden, that goes away. The next really big change we need to make to the model is to give a bend to the neck from the side. So let's turn it this way. I'm going to make sure that dynamic perspective is turned off so that we have an orthographic view, and that way we won't have as much distortion here. And I'll hold S to make my brush size bigger. I'll drag that slider over some. And we want to select, by holding Control and dragging on the model, we want to select the upper part of it down to about the chin. So I'll make the brush a bit smaller and finish up the selection like this. And just make sure that we didn't miss anything. And I want to soften this edge right here so that we don't get a harsh crease. So I'll hold Control and click a few times on the part of the mesh that is masked. And then what we can do is push W on the keyboard. And that brings up a widget that we can use to move around the selected geometry. So what we want to do is hold Alt on the keyboard and drag on this little handle here to relocate it. And we want to put it pretty much at this transitionary area between the masked and unmasked part. And now we'll drag on this to rotate the shoulders back. If we were to draw a straight line on the face, it would angle back in space, and right now the sculpted face is more vertical. So we need to Control drag to deselect the mask, and we want to rotate the head back in space. So let's press W to bring up the widget, and right now probably by default it will look like this, and so if we do the rotation, the eyes and the mouth will get left behind. So let's undo that. We want to click this button here, and this will make it so that all of the subtools will rotate. And now we can go back to about that angle. Again, we're working general to specific, so we're trying to make the largest changes first. And the next big change that I think needs to be made is to open up the mouth to make it look more like the reference image. I think the easiest way of doing this is to zoom in on the mouth area. Let's go to Dynamic Solo in order to hide the mouth parts. And we're going to use our selection lasso. So again, if you don't have the lasso as the current selection tool, you can Shift Control click on this button here, and you can select the select lasso. And what we'll do is hold Shift, Control, and Alt, and we'll drag in very carefully. Notice it's giving us a red indication of what's going to go away. And we'll select this whole lower area. And when you orbit down, it should look like this, so that the mouth has been divided perfectly in half. And let's zoom back some. And we'll Shift, Control, Alt again to select the lower part of the body. So now the only stuff that is showing up is the upper half. And now if we Control click, it will mask the upper part of the head. If we Control Shift click, it will bring back the lower half. And like before, when we selected the head to do the neck rotation, we have this really sharp edge between the masked and the unmasked area. We want to soften this up before we move the mouth open. So let's Control click a few times on the masked area and watch how that softens up. And now what we can do is type in BMV on the keyboard, BMV, to bring up the Move tool. And let's make our brush pretty big. And we'll go to about this angle. And then we can bring the jaw down some. I'll make the brush a bit smaller. And it looks like the mouth needs to open up a bit. And once you're happy with the new location of the chin and jaw and the general shape of the mouth, you can Control drag to get rid of the mask. Now we'll turn Dynamic Solo off, and we want to move the mouth parts where they need to go. And let's click on the upper mouth, so I'll Alt click on it. We'll go to the side view and push W. We need to turn off this mode to move all selected subtools, because we only want to move this part. And then we also need to relocate this widget to be closer to the part we want to move, just to make it easier to see what's going on. And we'll rotate the teeth to be about, maybe about like that. Then we'll push Q to turn off the Move widget. And let's click on the lower mouth and push W again. And we'll move this up and rotate it some. And then again, push Q to turn off the widget. In the reference image, the character's eyes are plain spheres. And so we're going to switch these eyes around. We'll just rotate them back in space to hide the pupil and iris. So by Alt-clicking on them, we can then push W. Let's turn Dynamic Solo on to make it easier to see what's going on. And we'll Alt-drag this handle up to put it in the center of the eye. And then we can just rotate this around. I think the next big change we need to make to the model is to give him hair. So we can do that by going to our Subtool panel and then go down to Append, and we'll just choose a sphere. And it comes in this case, really large, and it's also dark gray, which means it's not our current subtool. So we can Alt-click on it and then push W, and we'll just scale this in. So I'm grabbing that middle part of the widget to scale it in uniformly, and then we'll move it back to about this area. Let's make sure that we've got it as close to centered as we can. And we can scale it one-dimensionally as well by using this blue handle here. And let's rotate it back in space. Because it needs to be a little bit deeper than it is wide. A final step I'd like us to do with the hair before we move on is to fix the symmetry. If we push X, that will make it so that our brush strokes will have a symmetrical effect on the model. But the problem is, if the underlying geometry is itself not symmetrical, it won't be even on either side. So what we need to do is go to the geometry panel and then down to modify topology, and we want to select mirror and weld. And if X is turned on here, when we click this button, it will mirror the left side of the sphere to the right. So let me push Shift F and undo that so you can see what it looks like. So you can see how we now have this seam across, indicating how it just got flipped over to the other side. In our reference image, the model has a lot of asymmetry in his hair and his expressions. But in the early stages of sculpting, it helps to keep the symmetry on, because there are basic things like fixing the hair back here that will be easier if we can do it to both sides at once. So we'll move the hair down with the move brush. And again, the way that we can select the move brush is BMV, or you could push B and search for the move brush within this panel. But anyhow, we'll go ahead and drag this into place. Now the thing to know about the move brush is it works relative to your point of view. So if I want to move something back in space, it helps to be looking from the side. If I want to move it to the right or left, it helps to look at it from the front or back. And we're just trying to, at this point, get some of the major issues with the volume figured out. Before we move on, there's a problem with the mouth I'd like to fix, and it is that this area right here tapers down way too much. It gets to be too thin. So what we want to do is grab these inside faces here and scoot them over to the left. So if we use the move brush and drag over, that does not work. The reason is that the move brush is actually reaching through to the outside of the cheek and is pulling that along. So what we need to do is use back face masking. And I've set up a simpler example to just make sure that this is totally clear. We have this sort of disc-like thing here. Let's make our brush a bit bigger. And so we still have the move brush turned on. So if we want to move these faces over, we can drag here. And again, we have that problem where the faces on the other side are coming along. So what we want to do is to go to Brush, go down to the Auto Masking section here, and then we want to turn Back Face Mask on. Now, if we grab this side and drag over, nothing happens on the other side. So it will ignore the back faces. I set up a similar example down here. So if we push Shift F, you can see that we've got two polygroups, and those polygroups are on the same subtool. If we use the move brush and pull, both of the polygroups will be affected. But if we go to Brush, Auto Masking, and slide this Mask by Polygroups slider over to 100, now whichever polygroup is more within the brush when we start will be the only one that is affected. So this can be helpful to know about as well for auto masking. Now I'll go ahead and fix that issue I was concerned about. We're starting to get some stretching. If we push Shift F, you can see how stretched out some of these mesh faces are. What we need to do is go ahead and Dynamesh the face. Let's look at this simple example to illustrate what Dynamesh does. Let's go to the Merge panel. We'll merge down to put all of this stuff on the same subtool. And let's go down now to the Geometry panel, and we'll go to the Dynamesh section. And let's set the resolution all the way down to 8 and push the Dynamesh button. If we push Shift F, we can still see polygroups on the model, but clearly something has changed. It's just become very blocky. When we push the Dynamesh button in ZBrush, the program will divide the 3D space up into cells, and it will determine whether each cell should be something or nothing. And in this case, because our cell size is so coarse, because we have a low resolution, we get a very blocky result. If we look up at the top, we have an active point count just of about 1,600 points. If we undo and we do the Dynamesh command again, but this time with a resolution of 128, we now have a much finer result, and we also have a higher point count, so we have almost 100,000 points. If we were to use a resolution of 1,000, we would be probably at the range of several million polygons. And that would get very heavy, very computationally expensive. It would slow down the sculpting progress. So we want to make sure that we're not overdoing it with the level of resolution we give to our project. Another thing to keep in mind when working with Dynamesh is that you will need to periodically re-Dynamesh your model in order to get rid of stretched vertices. So right now I'm using the clay buildup brush. If we push Shift F, we can look at how these polygons have gotten quite stretched out here. So they're no longer as smooth as we need them to be to sculpt effectively. So we can control drag to re-Dynamesh the model. And now we've got a decent resolution here so we can continue sculpting. Let's go back to the head and Dynamesh it. Before we do though, because we have this open area at the bottom, we need to close this up first. Otherwise we'll get a weird result along this edge. So we can go to under the geometry panel, let's go down to modify topology and close holes. And let me orbit down so you can see better what this is doing. It will close up that whole open area. And now if we go to Dynamesh, and let's try a resolution of 128 first and see how that does. I think that looks a little bit too low resolution in some areas. Let's undo, and we'll set it to 512. That looks a lot better. Now we'll smooth out the body a bit, and then we will adjust this area, and we'll work on the hair some. And we'll just go through by holding Shift and just going to get rid of some of these weird blocky rough areas. We'll do the same up here. We want to be careful to not get too aggressive with our smoothing because we can lose some of the details. I would get concerned about the ear if we were to be too rough with this. That looks fine. Okay, so let's now trim off part of this area. We want to flatten it out to be more like that. So let's Shift Control, grab the select lasso, and Shift Control Alt. That should be fine. So we just hid part of the mesh, and now we can go to modify topology. This is under the geometry panel, and del hidden. And now if we control drag in a blank area, that will re-Dynamesh the mesh and cap off the open part. While we're here, I want to go ahead and flatten out this whole area. And there are two brushes we could use for this. BFA will open up, oops, wrong key. BFA will open up the flatten brush, and flatten will respect edges. So if we drag in, it will try not to violate this edge that we have along here. Another brush that we could use is trim dynamic. So BTD, and we're not going to see much difference in this case, but like if you were to use this on the edge, it will slice right into it in a way that the flatten brush would not. Another brush you can try in an area like this is hard polish. So BHP, and if we make this larger, this will also, like the flatten brush, it will flatten out this area while respecting the edges that we have here. The inflate brush is also useful. BIN is how we pull it up. And if we want to add volume to the lips, like especially around the bottom area, inflate is a good brush for that. The main brushes I'll use for sculpting the hair are clay buildup, move, and Damien standard. So let's try those out. B, C, B is how you pull up the clay buildup brush. If we Alt tap on the hair, that will make it the active subtool. And this is what clay buildup looks like by default. Actually, that doesn't really show us very well because the Dynamesh, oh, did we even Dynamesh this yet? I guess we didn't. Let's switch that over. So Dynamesh, let's try a resolution of 128. That's not going to be enough. We'll need to set it to at least 256, I think. I think that's enough to get started. So this is what clay buildup will look like with this alpha. I would normally switch it over to alpha 6. I like the edge that it gives us better with that. Now, clay buildup is great if you want to add material, or if you want to remove material, you can Alt drag and it will kind of cut out in a volumetric way material. So let's go ahead and kind of bulk this up in the areas that we need it. The reason that I still have symmetry turned on is I don't want to have to sculpt the sides of the hair twice because this is just an example project and we're trying to complete it pretty quickly. I'm going to turn the Z intensity up for this brush because I want to be able to add material a bit faster. And we will start to kind of bulk out some of these areas. If we turn the mesh and look at it from the front, the hair looks way too big. We have to keep in mind that we right now, with dynamic perspective turned off, we have an orthographic view. And I think that it is helpful to look at it also with dynamic perspective turned on. It doesn't look nearly as big. But anyway, I think that we need to bring in the sides still. We'll open up the move brush, BMV, and drag it in. That's what we want to do. But look, it's not moving. That's because we must have an inverted mesh here or something weird like that so that back face masking is interfering with the move brush. So we'll go to brush and go down and turn off back face mask. And now we can bring this in some. Another important brush to know about is Damien standard. So if we push BDS on the keyboard, that opens up the Dam standard brush. And this one will cut into the material like a knife. And let's see, I'm trying to look carefully at the visual references so that I'm making decisions based on what we see there. I find that much easier than trying to make this stuff up in my imagination. And it looks like we need to actually add some resolution to our mesh. So let's set Dynamesh to 512 now. And nothing happens because we still need to control drag in a blank spot. Now we've got more polys to deal with there so that when we cut in here, we should get a much better result. At this point, I've covered most of the elements that you need to know about to do the sculpt yourself, but there is one final brush I need to show you, a brush and a mode. So let's go back to our demo object here, and let's turn on Sculptris mode up here, and then let's type in BSK to open up the snake hook brush. Now, if we make our brush kind of large, and let's push Shift F so we can see the polygroups, and we drag out from the model, you can see that snake hook is enabling us to stretch out these really long sections from the model. And what's happening with Sculptris mode turned on is it's actually creating new polygons as we drag out. If we turn Sculptris off, and drag out. There's a limit to how far we can go, and it'll start to stretch out and get these really ugly looking sections. So let me undo that. Again, with Sculptris turned on, it will generate new polygons as we pull out with snake hook. Something to keep in mind about using snake hook with Sculptris is it will give you a result based on the scale of the brush. So if we push S and drag this slider over to make our brush smaller, it will give us a denser result with more polygons. Or a larger brush will give us a much coarser mesh when we drag out. Another interesting thing to know about using Sculptris is the effect that we get when we smooth out the mesh. So if we hold Shift and click on that part of the mesh, it will actually delete those faces. So this is a very different behavior than we get with normal smoothing. That can be really helpful if there's a section of your mesh that you want to get rid of. The reason I wanted to show this to you is if you're dealing with a grotesque that has hair that extends way out into space like this, I think using Sculptris with snake hook would make the process of sculpting those areas a lot easier. Now let's add the base. I made this simple version of a base in Rhino and turned it into a mesh and exported it as an OBJ, and it's in the download folder. So if you get that onto your computer and then go to Subtool, and what we have to do actually if we want to import the new piece of geometry is we have to make a dummy object here. Append, cube, it could be anything, it doesn't have to be a cube necessarily, and then select that to be your active subtool, and then go to import up here, and then find the base OBJ and open it. And so what that does is it replaces your dummy object with the imported item. So anyway, now we'll push W and I'll hold Alt to make it so that we can move this without affecting the object. And we'll click on this button, go to Unmasked Mesh Center, and then we'll grab that middle part to scale it in uniformly. And where are we in space? I'm going to turn dynamic perspective off, and we'll get it down to about here. Let's turn to the side, move it forward. It's still quite a bit too large. And we'll have to scale it one-dimensionally, it looks like. And it looks like also we're going to have to taper in the base of his neck some, but we can get to that later. That's good enough. Now I'm going to push the mic out of the way and just focus on sculpting for a little bit. And when I get to the point of being ready to break the symmetry, I'll come back and have a few more things to say. I think we've taken this as far as we can with Symmetry turned on. So let's go ahead and turn Symmetry off with the X key. It looks to me like the left side of his body is lower and that his head is turned slightly to the right. So let's take all of the subtools and merge them down. Okay, merge down, merge down, merge down. Everything but the base we'll put on one layer, on one subtool. And then we'll control select the entire upper half of the mesh. That might be too much. Let's get a smaller brush and grab his chin. Okay. Oh, we forgot something back here. Okay, and I'll control click a few times on this to soften up the mask. And then what I want to do is, let's turn dynamic perspective off. Oop. And we'll push W to bring up the move widget. I'll hold Alt and click on go to unmasked mesh center. And then let's click on reset orientation as well while holding Alt to just make the gumball go back to its typical orientation. Now we'll let go of Alt and just turn the shoulders some in space this way. And now we'll control click out here to reverse the mask, and let's turn his head some the opposite direction. It also looks like he needs to maybe look up more. With the move brush still selected, we will go through and move some of these parts around to get similar result as what we see in the visual reference. This eye needs to get scooted up some. And it looks like it's more open than the other eye too. Let me see if I can just grab the top. The nose is asymmetrical too. It looks like maybe this side needs to come in some, this needs to go up a bit. Let's see how it looks in the side view. I messed up the Adam's apple during the transformation. This needs to come up some. Now there is some interesting stuff going on with the angle of his teeth here. Like they're not straight across like you would expect them to be. And I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and split the teeth back onto its own sublayer. So we'll click. So let me undo that. Shift Control click on the teeth. Shift Control again, and then we'll go to split hidden. We'll do the same thing for the upper teeth. Where did everything go? Oh, I see what's going on. Let's see. Shift Control. There we go. Split hidden. And we'll go ahead and keep the eyes on the same layer, but let's put the hair on its own layer as well. Okay, so Shift F to turn that off. And then let's go down to the lower teeth. I'll alt-click here. And we want to raise up the tongue as well. Did I separate that? No, it's all part of the same polygroup. So I'm going to click on Dynamic Solo. And we need to split the tongue from the teeth. So let's go to this angle. And we'll make our brush a bit smaller. And we'll do a control drag here. We'll make a new polygroup in a second. Okay, so Control W to make a new polygroup. And let's make sure that we get a complete break between the tongue and the teeth. Shift Control click again. And then we can go to Polygroups and Auto Groups. Let's click again just to get some more distinctive color change between the two. And that's fine. Shift Control click on the tongue, and then we'll go to Subtool, Split Hidden. So if we turn Dynamic Solo off, now we have the tongue on a new subtool, and we can sculpt it independently from the teeth. It's a bit lumpy, but the tongue plays a pretty minor role in the overall appearance of the sculpture, so we're just going to go with it. And I want to make the mouth go farther back in space like it would be on a real human. So I'll control drag in this area to mask out the back of the mouth, and we'll control click on that a few times to soften the edge of the mask, and we'll control click out here to invert the mask. And now if we go to the side view and push W, and I'll alt drag this over here to put it about in line with where that part of the mouth is, we can drag this back in space and down a bit maybe. How does that look? It looks like it needs to maybe open up a bit. I think that'll work fine. We'll push Q to turn off the gumball and control drag to get rid of the mask. And I'll make a couple of final changes to the mouth. BMV, and I want to just get the curl of the tongue to be a little bit more visible from the front. And then we'll click on the teeth, alt click, and I think the brush needs to be a bit smaller. Drag that down, move this up, move this down to get some of that odd irregularity we see in the visual references. And I also see something going on with the teeth where they're not quite symmetrical here. On the top. Maybe that needs to go back in space a bit. There are many more details we could add to this sculpt to take it further with the wrinkles and the skin textures and the nuances of his expression. But let's act as though we're finished with the model and we're ready to export to another program for the purpose of visualization. We just want to make a good, clear render of the project. And that our intention is to just put a simple gray material on the whole thing so that we don't need to be able to individually assign materials to each of the parts. Before exporting, there are a few things I would recommend doing. One is I would reduce the point count for the model. Right now we're at 1,000,000 points, which is going to be taxing for another program to deal with. And another issue is it will be simpler to deal with the model if all of these parts are on one subtool before we export. So I'll show you the steps in making this happen. Let's go down to Merge, and we'll click Merge Visible. And that creates a new tool up here that we can click on, Merged Demo Head. There are some problems with the model. You can see that the teeth look like they're inverted and the eyes have disappeared. The reason that this happened is we have some flipped normals in these spots. So let's delete this one. And we'll go back to Demo Head. And we'll go down now to Display Properties. Now let's push the up key until we're at the topmost subtool. And we'll uncheck double. And then I'm going to push the down key to go to the next subtool. And I'll keep going down and turning off double for all of these. Oops. So now we can identify the problems. Which of the subtools do we have active right now? The base. So we'll go up. The tongue looks fine. I think whatever it is must be flipped. Okay. Teeth. Okay, there we go. The hair looks fine. We'll need to flip the eyes as well. Now that everything is showing up right, we're ready to merge. So we'll go to Merge Visible. And again, we have a merge project here where everything is together. And now we need to reduce the face count. So we'll go to Z Plugin. And I'll click on this top left button here and drag this over to the right so that it will stay open. And we'll go to Decimation Master. And we need to click on Pre-Process Current. And what that will do is analyze the model. You can see there's a status bar up here showing that it's checking it. And let's set this now to 10. So right now we're at 1,000,000 active points. If we set this to 10% of decimation and decimate current, we now have 100,000 faces. And if we push Shift F, the model is much less complex than it was before. So now we can go to Export, and I'll just save it to the desktop. Example. And now we can go to Keyshot and import the model. And there it is. So at this point, I think we've covered all of the main elements you need to know about to get started with sculpting in ZBrush. And so we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. I hope you found this tutorial useful.